When you consider the world that we live in today, I don't think that there is anyone who would argue that we do not have all the necessities and the resources in this life and in this world to be able to survive. When I think about the world and I think about how it was designed and created, there is nothing here that human beings are lacking in which we have to go into outer space or anywhere else in order to live and to survive and to thrive here on earth. The reason I believe that this is the case is because not only does science and experience tell us this, but also too because I am a Bible believing Christian, I believe in the providence of God. Now, when you think about the providence of God, if you were to look that word providence up, you might find some kind of definition that states something like the foreseeing care and guidance of God over the creatures of this earth. You might see something where it might say something like it's some kind of manifestation of divine care. And when you think about providence and you think about the word provision, they're very closely related. The word provision basically means the providing or the supply of something, especially of food or other necessities. So when I think about the necessities of life, I think about God as the one who provides these things for us. The necessities of life often would include things like food, water, shelter, clothing, and etc. And it is God, of course, who provides these things for each and every person on earth. Whether they're a believer or an unbeliever, it doesn't really matter because we all are blessed to experience God's physical and material blessings here in this life. But sometimes there are things, of course, that do happen when these necessities do become scarce. For instance, in times of famine and things like that that happen. It is during these times where our faith also may be tested to see if we really believe, if we really have faith that God is going to provide for us. I think we do have one such example where we can clearly see God's provision, his providence in our lives by the example in the way that he dealt with an Old Testament prophet and a widow. This is a story found in 1 Kings chapter 17, if you want to open your Bibles and look at that story there with me, as that will be the scripture I'm going to be coming from for today's lesson. In 1 Kings chapter 17, we have here where we find God's Old Testament prophet, one of God's greatest prophets in the Old Testament, a man by the name of Elijah. And Elijah, again, is to go to a king. His name is Ahab, who was king over Israel, king over the northern kingdom, who married a woman by the name of Jezebel. You've probably heard that name before at one point in time in your life. And if not, understand that Jezebel was a very wicked woman. And you find very few, if any, women that actually have the name Jezebel. And so Jezebel and Ahab were basically leading the children of Israel astray. And Elijah was a prophet of God who was sent to King Ahab to tell him that Israel was going to be punished because of its great wickedness. Through the influence of Ahab and his wicked wife Jezebel, Israel had started worshiping Baal and Ashtaroth, which are two false gods, and some of the other heathen gods from some of the other nations, the Gentiles around them. So as a punishment, God says that he is going to make it stop raining. And that's exactly what happened. For 3.5 years, it did not rain. If you look at 1 Kings chapter 17 and verse number 1, here's where the story begins. It says, "And Elijah the Tishbite of the inhabitants of Gilead said to Ahab, As the Lord God of Israel lives, before whom I stand, there shall not be dew nor rain these years, except at my word." So again, we find here that it was not going to rain. And ultimately, we're going to find out in the time period later down the line that it does take about 3.5 years or so before it actually does rain again. But can you imagine how terrible that must have been? Me personally, since I've been born and raised in South Texas, it can get very hot and very dry, especially in the summer times. There are a lot of ranchers and farmers, of course, in the area that often would pray for rain and ask God to bless them with rain so that the rain would bless the crops to grow and for the cattle to be able to live and to survive so that we could have food. And there are some times where it would go weeks and in some cases months without rain. where things would get very, very serious to the point where it almost might be considered a state of an emergency. But again, after time, what ultimately would happen is God would bless us with rain, and usually a mighty good, healthy rain. But can you imagine that for 3.5 years, there was no rain at all? With us, when there is no rain, we begin to get messages from many of the people in the area. We get our water source and supply from the Edwards Aquifer here in the San Antonio area where I live, and most of South Central Texas in this area. We begin to have things like water restrictions where you can't water your lawn on certain days, or you can only do it certain amount of times a week, I should say. They began to limit certain things, as far as what we can do when it comes to our water. And so can you imagine how difficult it must have been at this point in time where there was no rain in the area, and how difficult it must have been for them to be able to survive, and how they might have had to ration out their water, and what did they do to take care of their crops and their animals for food. When Elijah goes and he talks to them, and of course he gives them this message, I could imagine that this message was not something that they accepted very well. Because almost immediately after they received this message, it says in verse number 2, then the word of the Lord came to him, speaking of Elijah, saying, get away from here and turn eastward and hide by the brook Cherith, which flows into the Jordan. And it will be that you shall drink from the brook, and I have commanded the ravens to feed you there. So he went and did according to the word of the Lord, for he went and stayed by the brook Cherith, which flows into the Jordan. The ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning, and bread and meat in the evening, and he drank from the brook. And it happened after a while that the brook dried up, because there had been no rain in the land. Now, when I look at this, I do not only just see that God, of course, is obviously taking care and providing for his man, for his people, Elijah in this case, by providing him food and water to be able to live and to survive. But also, too, as I kind of emphasize the word that we see there in verse number 3, that he was to hide. I can imagine that this message, again, being given to King Ahab and being given to Queen Jezebel, was not very flattering. It was not a very, very good message, of course, obviously, for them. They probably did not take too kindly to Elijah's words, because, again, God was going to withhold the dew and the rain from them for years, except at his word. And so I could imagine that they probably were pretty angry about this. And so God says, in order to keep you from being killed by them, I want you to go. I'm going to protect you, and you're going to go hide by this brook that I'm going to send to you, where you'll be fed with bread and food by the ravens. But of course, at the months of no rain, eventually the brook was going to dry up. So Elijah had to go somewhere else. So the word of the Lord comes to Elijah, and it must have sounded like, how we tell people sometimes, I have good news and I have bad news. The good news is that when the word of the Lord comes to him in chapter 17 and verse number 9, God is telling him where he wants him to go. I want you to arise, and I want you to go to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and I want you to dwell there. Now, the reason why I say that this must have been good news and bad news is because the good news is that as you have been provided for by living by this brook, and being taken care of by living by this brook, and now the brook is dried up, you obviously need to go somewhere else in order for you to survive. So that is good news. You do get a chance to leave the brook here at Cherith, but I want you to go to Zarephath. And Zarephath is a very interesting place because, as it's mentioned here, Zarephath belongs to Sidon. And he tells him, I want you to dwell there. Now, I know that most of us probably geographically are not very familiar or even historically familiar with these places. But it's not until you study these areas and understand more specifically, this was a very dangerous situation that Elijah could have been going into. The reason why I say this is that Zarephath was a small town along the Mediterranean coast in a land called Phoenicia. And when you look and understand the background of this town, this just so happens to be the town where Queen Jezebel actually came from. It was Jezebel's hometown, the capital of Phoenicia. It also was a center for worship of Baal and Ashtaroth, which is what was leading the children of Israel astray and worshiping these false gods. So God is sending Elijah to Jezebel's hometown, this place, this center of this idolatrous worship. Now, I guess from a human reasoning standpoint, we probably would say to ourselves, that really does not make any sense. Why would God do something like that? But it's so interesting again that that as the Lord does this, and he always does things with a purpose or a reason. And looking at it from this standpoint, we're looking at it as like, why would he do this? Because obviously the brook was a great hiding place for him. He probably knew every inch of that area. We knew that it's very possible that Ahab and Jezebel could have been chasing him to take his lives. And if they came and found eventually where he was at, where this was actually located, he could very easily escape into the mountains and into the ravines of Gilead that he knew probably pretty well by this point. Excuse me. But now he's going to this town, a town in which he's going to be a stranger, a town in which everybody in this small town probably knew each other. They would recognize someone who was a stranger, where he could be in danger, possibly being arrested. It could even very likely be maybe some relatives of Jezebel that might have still even dwelt there. But God goes there and he sends him there for a specific purpose. And as he goes there, he's going to come across a widow. So in verses 8 and 9, when it says, the word of the Lord came to him, saying, arise and go to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and dwell there. He says, see, I have commanded a widow there to, and here's that word, provide for you. Think about this for just a few moments. The Lord is saying, or at least is telling him, see, I have commanded a widow there to provide for you. Think about this. A widow, obviously a woman who was married, that her husband is no longer alive. You're going to find out, of course, she does have a small child. But here is a woman that is going to provide for Elijah, this man. And we find that as he goes, in verse number 10, it says, so he arose and he went to Zarephath. And when he came to the gate of the city, indeed, a widow was there gathering sticks. And he called to her and he said, please bring me a little water in a cup that I may drink. And so he comes across this widow, and he basically sees her gathering sticks. She's basically gathering sticks, obviously, to probably cook food, to make food. And Elijah asked her for a cup of water. So in verse 11, it says that she's going to get it. He called to her and he said, and now he's going to ask her for something else. Please bring me a morsel of bread in your hand. So in verse 12, we find a response. She says, as the Lord your God lives, I do not have bread, only a handful of flour in a bin and a little oil in a jar. And see, I am gathering a couple of sticks that I may go in and prepare it for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die. So here's God saying, look, I'm gonna send you to this widow and she's going to take care of you. And then when Elijah gets there, he finds out she really doesn't even have anything to provide for him. Isn't that interesting? It's like God is saying, Elijah, yeah, I'm gonna send you here to this town. I'm gonna send you to this widow. She's gonna give you a place to stay. This poor woman, this poor widow, she's about to starve to death, but she's gonna take care of you. Once again, using human reasoning, it doesn't really seem like it makes much sense to us, right? Why would God, of course, do something like this? Well, it's so interesting. Again, once the way that God works, it's going back again to that testing of our faith. Do we really believe, of course, that God is going to provide for us? And so what we do is we do find that even though that this is the situation, Elijah does exactly what the Lord tells him or commands him to do. He approached the city gates. He finds that woman gathering the sticks, as she explains that she's going to gather a couple of sticks to cook her last meal, and that she and her son will die. Evidently, she must have already been starving because this was, in her words, her last meal. This was going to be the last meal that she'd have in her house. And she would prepare this meal, and then her and her son ultimately were going to perish. And when Elijah hears this, we would obviously think that the empathetic thing, the obvious thing to do would probably be like, well, I'm sorry to hear that. Why don't you go ahead and just make your meal and you and your son eat and you guys take care of yourself? The Lord is going to provide for me. But what's interesting is that might have been some of our response. But if you really look at what God is saying, God told him in verse number 9, see, I have commanded a woman there to provide for you. So this is why he makes such a strange request, but he does so by also kind of giving her a level of comfort in verse number 13. The Bible goes on to say, and Elijah said to her, do not fear. Go and do as you have said, but first make me a small cake from it first, and bring it to me, and afterward make some for yourself and your son. And again, when you hear that, you're like, well, is this request something that is selfish? Well, no, it's not really selfish as much as it is his faith in God, the fact that God said that he was going to provide. And then he goes on to tell her why he's basically making this request from her, because this is what God had told him. In verse number 14, for thus says the Lord God of Israel, the bin of flour shall not be used up, nor shall the jar of oil run dry until the day of the Lord sends rain on the earth. So she went away and she did according to the word of Elijah. And she and he and her household ate for many days. The bin of flour was not used up, nor did the jar of oil run dry, according to the word of the Lord, which he spoke by Elijah. Once again, just kind of looking at this, it does seem to be a strange request that Elijah ultimately made. But he had enough faith in God, knowing that God, of course, was going to provide for him. And as he is telling her what God has shared with him about how God is going to take care of them both, she obviously had to have enough faith in him and also enough faith in God and understanding that the Lord, of course, was going to do exactly what he said. So we see that after this request was made, that's exactly what she did. I mean, you think about this woman's situation, it did take a level of faith for her to be able to do this. She had just one child. Apparently, the child seemed to be a very young child. She had a very tragic life. She's a widow. She apparently lost her husband. We're not quite sure exactly when, but that must have been very difficult for her to lose, who was supposed to be the protector and provider of her household. Apparently, there were some things going on where it was very difficult for them to be able to survive. She was down to just one bowl of this flour, this cornmeal. She had a little bit of this olive oil that she had. Basically, she was going to make this, this small cake and pretty much cook it, eat it, and die. And that pretty much was her plan. She had just enough to prepare one, not even enough to prepare one for her and one for her son. But again, she had enough faith in what Elijah said. So she prepared this little cake for Elijah. He sat down and he ate it, and there was enough to go around for all three of them. And then you could imagine that as it continues to go on, the next day that she looked and there was more flour in her bowl and there was more oil, and maybe she could have been thinking to herself, didn't I use this up or was close to using this up yesterday, but yet there's still more here. And so she uses it again and she makes another little cake, and the three of them are able to eat again. And day by day, it just seems like that this is the same thing that continues to happen every single day, that God was continuing to provide for them. And we see that this happened over quite some time. In fact, it seemed like that this more than likely happened over a 2-year time period. Elijah and the widow were fed pretty much like this day by day as you look as, everything that was going on and what was happening at this point. Their needs were being met. They were being provided for by God. And when you look at this story, you can't help but think that God has such a marvelous way of taking care of each and every one of us if we were just willing to have enough faith in him that he's going to be able to do that for us. Sometimes God will use miraculous ways like this, as we see here in the Bible, and sometimes not, especially in the day and age in which we live in. But one thing that we can know for sure, however way that God is going to provide for us, however way he's going to enact his providence in our lives, we have to realize that he's always going to find a way to take care of his people. And I believe the words of the Apostle Paul in the New Testament, in Philippians chapter 4 and verse number 19, where he's writing to the Philippians. Here is a man that again is under Roman guard. He's under prison, Roman prison, as we might many people like to say. He's a man that was lacking some things, but yet he said he had learned to be content. He knew that he could do all things through Christ Jesus, who strengthened him. And he had the boldness to, or the confidence to be able to say, my God shall supply your needs according to his riches in glory by Christ Jesus. And that is something I truly, truly believe for every single one of his children. So we see that God is supplying for their needs. And through this drought, when everyone around them could have been struggling to get by, Elijah and this widow and her son had their needs met by God. Now, again, we got to keep in mind, this wasn't a feast, right? I mean, it wasn't like they were eating steak and potatoes every single night, but guess what? It was food. It was something that which they were able to eat. And of course, as I mentioned, God was still providing for them. And so that is really the point that I think that we need to be able to see there. But, as often is the case, though, right, that there are those times where, things seem like they were bad. Elijah had to go and run and hide. And then God found a place for him where God was taking care of him by the brook at Cherith. Then that ran out, and then he had to leave. And then now he's in this situation. And now God is providing for him this way through this widow. And again, just as this seems to be like everything is working out, guess what happens? Another crisis comes in their lives. Something happens, something so sudden that happened to them that it took both the widow and Elijah by surprise. We have another crisis that is going to happen that you see starting at about verse number 17 down through the end of the chapter. In verse number 17, it says, now it happened after these things that the son of the woman who owned the house became sick. And his sickness was so serious that there was no breath left in him. You look at the fact that this woman's son became sick. There's another crisis, not only just in Elijah's life, but now it's in this woman's life. And sometimes we know that that's just sometimes how life just seems to work. There's just one crisis out of another. I know that many people know exactly what I'm talking about. You get one thing worked out or something squared away in your life, and then something else begins to happen and fall apart, right? You get sick, you get your doctor bills, you get better. And at the moment you get your doctor bills paid off and you're beginning to get better, someone else, gets sick, and you almost like repeating the same cycle over and over. And sometimes it seems like it just never stops. Sometimes it just seems there's just one thing after another. I know that you've probably heard that phrase before, maybe even said it yourself before, that when it rains, it pours. And, sometimes, the great crisis in life, they really do come after some act of commitment, especially when we've rededicated ourselves to God or to the Lord and to do his will. When you've determined to do God's will, that's when sometimes these tests will come into your lives. There may be some area in your life where you struggle, where I may struggle to do what God has called us to do. And maybe this is one way where the Lord is helping us get to where we need to be. And so here we go as we find one of these situations that seems to be going on in the life of Elijah and also the life of this widow. Elijah and this widow are confronted with a very great tragedy. Here, this woman's son, unfortunately, gets sick and dies. We don't want something like that happening. We know that it's not natural for a parent to outlive the life of their children. And then on top of that, this child apparently was pretty young still. And again, maybe in human thinking, in her thinking, in Elijah's thinking, in our own thinking, we might just be wondering what is going on. Why is this happening? The widow had to be pretty hurt. And I imagine that Elijah must have been pretty hurt. I mean, if this all happened over months and years, how much time did Elijah spend with them to get to know them? I mean, if this was a young boy, a young child as it seems to be, I'm sure Elijah must have grown to love the boy just as much as the mother. Not as much, obviously, with motherly love, but a lot. He probably played with the boy. He probably spent time with them, maybe teaching him some things, maybe helping him to learn who the true and living God is. Maybe he could have been much like a father figure to this boy, or maybe even a grandfather figure. Who knows? But now the child is gone. And again, it's just a terrible, terrible circumstance, a terrible situation that we see that has happened here. But we do still find that God is in control. And he still cares for Elijah and for this widow. It's just something just about death that just many people just find that to be just the worst tragedy that just can seem to happen in our lives. I mean, because it's just one of those things that we fear because we just have no control over it. I mean, it really reminds us of our weakness. It reminds us of our mortality. It reminds us of our lack of power. And again, death is just a great fear that everybody has in our world because of just the unknown. And then the separation that we have from those of whom we love. And I think it's always been like that in Elijah's day and even in our day today. If you also keep in mind that if we study the Bible from the beginning of the Bible in Genesis, coming all the way back up to here in 1 Kings, it does seem like that at this point in time, even though there were many miracles done, especially when you think about Moses bringing the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt, there were a lot of miracles that had happened at that point in time. Things that happened in the days of the judges and just so many other things that had happened up until this point. One thing I don't think that we see is that there had not been anyone raised from the dead yet prior to this incident. Now, I could be wrong, but based on what I've studied and what I've looked at, that does seem to be the case. So once you pass from this life to the next life, there really was no hope in coming back. Now, once again, if that is true, imagine that again being the death of a child. Again, just something that is so difficult for us to handle. Something so difficult for anyone to have to be able to deal with. This woman was a widow. She'd already lost her husband. Now she loses her son. This would have been even more traumatic. Now she's basically doomed to a life of loneliness. She had no relatives, it seems, to be able to take care of her. We're not even sure if she had any friends. It doesn't even seem to be any indication of that. Her entire life seemed to be wrapped up with her and her son, and now her son is gone. I mean, it really almost does seem kind of hopeless. As long as she had a son, I mean, she could anticipate somebody to be there for her, somebody to take care of her in her old age. She probably could look forward to the time when he was old enough to, she wouldn't have to scrape and beg for her next meal, where he was able to work and he would be able to look after her and provide for her. But now he's gone. And anytime somebody that leaves us like that, I mean, we all experience many different emotions. We experience shock and denial and depression and loneliness and guilt and anger and just so many different things. And you could imagine that maybe she probably felt bad about this too, which is why she has the response that she has in verse number 18. Verse 18 says, "So she said to Elijah, 'What have I to do with you, O man of God? Have you come to me to bring my sin to remembrance and to kill my son?'" Look at what she's doing. She is blaming him. And, I'm not going to get on her too bad because I could kind of maybe understand a little bit of maybe why she felt the way she felt. Keep in mind, she probably was not a believer in the true and living God. And here's where it can help to be a believer in the true and living God, to really understand where we can place these kind of feelings instead of placing the blame at other people or the blame at God. But basically, you look at how she's kind of lashing out at them. She's kind of like saying, Elijah, basically, it's your fault. None of this would have happened if you would have never shown up. Never mind that if you hadn't shown up, if you would think about what was going on before when he first arrived there, she basically was saying that her and her son were going to eat their last meal and die. So her and her son would have died a long time ago. And now Elijah's God, when Elijah comes to her, has preserved her life and her son's life for many more months and many more years, probably. So never mind the fact that the flour and the oil have been miraculously replenished each and every day. But during times of crisis, though, sometimes we just don't have the tendency to think clearly. So you think that maybe if she could have been thinking clearly, would have thought and turned to Elijah and said, I need your help. But instead of turning to him for help, she turned away from him, and she's basically blaming him for her son's death. And again, I get it. I understand. It's a human characteristic that when tragedy happens, we want someone or something to blame. I certainly understand that. But you look here and it seems that she lashes out at him. It almost seems like she's trying to blame him, but even at the same time, she may even be blaming herself, because she says, "Have you come to bring my sin to remembrance and to kill my son?" It's almost like she's thinking that maybe it was her sin, this feeling of guilt, that because Elijah is a man of God, her sinful life is brought to remembrance, and because of her sinful life, now she's being punished by her son being taken from her. I think perhaps this widow's emotional outburst is uncovering some feelings of guilt that she hadn't been willing to admit to herself. And so that's why I think she kind of has the response that she seems to have here. But I think this is the ultimate test of her faith, and even Elijah's faith to some degree. I think that sometimes, like this, we see what God is trying to do in our lives. It seems that in some ways that as he's allowing these things to happen, God is wanting us to recognize again that he is still he's still in control, and he's still able to take care of us. When we get to this point where we realize, or we have to come to realize, that no matter what is going on in life, we definitely need God. There has to be this great need and dependence upon the Lord to be able to take care of us. And I think that's exactly what God is doing here. He has a way of getting our attention and helping us to realize this. And I think that in some ways, it's not even just for her, but it's even also for Elijah. I know the focus a lot of times on the story. Some people say the focus is on the widow. Other people say the focus can be on Elijah. I really think it's on both. I think God is allowing both of them to understand he's in control and he can provide for each and every one of us. So what is Elijah going to do as she does this? Well, in verse number 19, he says to her, "Give me your son." So he took him out of her arms, and he carried him to the upper room where he was staying, and he laid him out on his bed. Then he cried out to the Lord, and he said, "O Lord, my God, have you also brought tragedy on the widow with whom I lodged by killing her son?" And what's interesting about this is he seems to be maybe confessing some confusion. He's pouring out his heart before God. He is praying to God at this point in time. He prays, and it's at times like this when there are tragedies that are going on where when we don't understand something, maybe the best thing to do is to pray. And I think he's maybe giving the right response to the right action of going to God and offering this prayer to him to see what is going on. And again, I get it. The question does seem to be why. We all have those questions, Christians and non-Christians. Why does God allow us to do this? Why does God let this happen in our life? And I know that the Bible does give us many possible reasons of why suffering